Picture this. A king's coffin explodes during his own funeral, spraying rotting royal flesh across the countryside, while dogs lick up the remains from the road. This isn't fiction, this actually happened to Henry VIII in 1547, but the exploding coffin was just the finale to a horror story that began years earlier when England's most powerful ruler started rotting alive while still on the throne. His leg wounds were so infected that chunks of flesh would fall off his body as servants carried him from room to room. The smell was so overwhelming that courtiers would flee in terror, and by the end, even his own doctors refused to get close enough to treat him. What you're about to discover about Henry VIII's final years will make you understand why some historians believe he was literally cursed by God himself. Henry IV didn't just die, he decomposed while still breathing. By 1546, the king, who once stood 6 feet tall and commanded respect across Europe, had become a walking nightmare that terrified his own servants. His waist measured an astronomical 54 inches, but obesity was the least of his problems. Both legs were covered in massive, festering ulcers that never healed, constantly oozing pus and rotted flesh. The stench was so horrific that it could be detected several rooms away, and servants actually drew straws to determine who had the misfortune of dressing the king each morning. Court records from the time describe servants fainting from the smell alone, while others would vomit uncontrollably when forced to approach the royal presence. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In his youth, Henry had been considered one of Europe's most attractive monarchs. Standing over 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, he was an imposing figure who excelled at jousting, hunting, and dancing. Contemporary accounts describe him as having golden hair, piercing blue eyes, and a physique that commanded respect and admiration. He spoke multiple languages fluently, composed music, and was considered one of the most educated rulers of his time. But by his final decade, this same man had become a grotesque parody of royalty, a living reminder that even absolute power cannot conquer the human body's capacity for decay. Modern medical experts believe Henry suffered from a catastrophic combination of conditions that turned his body into a living hell. The jousting accident of 1536 left him unconscious for 2 hours, essentially dead by medieval standards. The massive brain trauma explains his transformation from a relatively normal young king into the paranoid, rage-filled monster of his later years, but the head injury was just the beginning. Doctors now suspect he also developed Cushing's syndrome, which caused the dramatic weight gain, violent mood swings, and those horrific leg wounds that refused to heal. The syndrome would explain his moon-shaped face, purple stretch marks, and the characteristic fat deposits around his neck and shoulders that made him appear even more grotesque in his final years. The leg ulcers that plagued Henry's final decade were unlike anything his physicians had ever encountered. These weren't simple wounds, they were massive, gaping holes in his flesh that penetrated deep into the muscle and possibly even reached the bone. The largest ulcer, located on his left thigh, measured nearly 8 inches in circumference and refused to heal despite the efforts of the best medical minds in Europe. The wounds would alternately close and reopen, creating a cycle of hope and despair that drove Henry to increasingly desperate measures. He tried everything from herbal poultices to prayers to having holy relics pressed against the infected flesh, but nothing provided lasting relief. The smell emanating from these wounds was beyond description. Court documents from the period use terms like putrid, pestilent, and abominable to describe the odor that followed the king wherever he went. Perfumers were employed full-time to create increasingly powerful scents to mask the stench, but nothing could completely cover the smell of rotting flesh. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself was recorded as having to excuse himself from a meeting with the king because the odour was so overwhelming that he feared he might vomit in the royal presence. The psychological torture he inflicted on his wives went far beyond simple execution. Take Anne Boleyn. Henry didn't just decide to kill her. He orchestrated an elaborate psychological campaign that forced her to watch as 5 innocent men, including her own brother, were executed for allegedly sleeping with her. She had to stand there knowing she was next, watching people die because of her husband's paranoid delusions. The trial was a complete sham, with evidence fabricated and confessions extracted under torture. Anne's musician, Mark Smeaton, was tortured until he confessed to adultery with the Queen, despite there being absolutely no evidence of any relationship between them beyond their professional interactions. Catherine Howard, barely a teenager when Henry married her, faced an even worse fate. When Henry discovered her past relationships, he didn't just execute her. He changed the entire legal system, making it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their complete sexual history. Catherine was essentially a child who had been sexually abused by older men before her marriage to the king, but Henry saw her victimization as betrayal. The new law he created, known as the Catherine Howard Act, remained in effect for centuries and destroyed countless lives. Catherine spent her final weeks in the Tower of London, reportedly practicing her walk to the execution block and rehearsing her final speech, knowing that any mistake would be seen as further evidence of her guilt. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, endured perhaps the longest psychological torture of all. After more than 20 years of marriage, Henry declared their union invalid and banished her from court. She was forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary, and was essentially held under house arrest in increasingly remote and uncomfortable locations. Henry spread rumours that she was mentally unstable and refused to acknowledge her royal status, insisting that she be addressed only as Princess Dowager of Wales rather than Queen. She died alone in 1536, possibly from poisoning, writing letters to Henry that he never bothered to read. Her final letter, written just before her death, was signed Catherine the Queen, her last act of defiance against the man who had destroyed her life. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was Henry's complete disconnection from reality in his final years. This man, who claimed to rule by divine right, couldn't control his own bodily functions. Royal attendants had to carry special chairs everywhere because Henry could barely make it from room to room without having an accident. The chairs, known as close stools, were elaborate affairs covered in velvet and equipped with chamber pots, but their luxury couldn't disguise their humiliating necessity. Court protocol required that servants pretend these incidents weren't happening, creating a surreal atmosphere where everyone had to ignore the obvious signs of the king's physical deterioration. His eating rituals became theatrical nightmares that consumed hours of each day and required the coordination of hundreds of servants. Henry consumed over 5,000 calories daily while barely able to move, convinced that eating swan would make him graceful, and that oysters would enhance his performance with wives he was simultaneously planning to execute. A typical meal for Henry included multiple whole animals, entire roasted pigs, dozens of chickens, various types of fish, and massive quantities of bread and wine. His personal kitchens employed over 200 people working in shifts around the clock to keep up with his appetite. The king had developed bizarre food superstitions that governed every meal. He believed that eating specific animals would transfer their characteristics to him, consuming large amounts of deer to become a better hunter, eating birds of prey to improve his vision, and gorging on predator fish to increase his aggression. These beliefs led to increasingly exotic and expensive dietary requirements that strained even the royal treasury. Merchants across Europe competed to supply the English court with rare delicacies, knowing that Henry would pay any price for foods he believed had magical properties. The paranoia that consumed his mind transformed the entire royal court into a surveillance state that would make modern dictators envious. Henry slept with loaded crossbows next to his bed, kept multiple daggers under his pillow, and stationed armed guards inside his bedroom to watch him sleep. The guards were rotated frequently to prevent any one person from becoming too familiar with the king's sleeping patterns, and they were forbidden from speaking to each other during their shifts. Even the king's dreams were monitored. Servants were instructed to listen for any words he might speak while sleeping and report them to his chief advisors. He created networks of spies whose job was to spy on his other spies, turning the palace into a psychological horror show where saying the wrong word to the wrong person meant death. The royal court became a maze of informants and counter-informants where longtime friends would betray each other for imagined rewards or simply to avoid suspicion. Conversations were conducted in whispers, and even family members couldn't trust each other. So, The king's paranoia was so contagious that it infected every level of court life, from the highest nobles to the lowliest servants. The physical architecture of Henry's palaces reflected his mental state. He ordered the construction of secret passages throughout every building he occupied, not for convenience or romance, but as escape routes in case assassins came for him. These passages were equipped with hidden doors, false walls, and emergency supplies. Some passages led to underground tunnels that extended for miles beyond the palace walls, allowing the king to flee undetected if necessary. Workmen who constructed these passages were often killed afterward to preserve their secrecy. Henry's food paranoia reached levels that bordered on the absurd. Not only did he require multiple tasters for every dish, but each ingredient had to be tested separately by different people. The salt, the spices, the cooking wine, everything was subjected to elaborate testing procedures that turned simple meals into military operations. The king required his tasters to wait 30 minutes after consuming anything before he would touch it, just to ensure they didn't succumb to slow-acting poisons. Some meals took 4 hours to complete, not because of their complexity, but because of the extensive safety protocols required. The testing procedures became so elaborate that they required their own staff and facilities. A separate kitchen was dedicated entirely to poison testing, and specialized servants were trained to detect signs of poisoning in the tasters. The king kept detailed records of which tasters tested which foods, creating a bureaucracy of paranoia that employed dozens of people whose only job was to potentially die for the king's peace of mind. Some tasters developed health problems from the constant exposure to rich foods and potential toxins, but they were forbidden from refusing their duties under penalty of death. Even Henry's children weren't safe from his suspicions. He had spies watching Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters, because he was convinced they were plotting against him. The children were forbidden from meeting privately and were required to have government-appointed companions who reported on their conversations and activities. Mary, in particular, was subjected to intense scrutiny because of her Catholic faith and her loyalty to her deceased mother, Catherine of Aragon. Henry suspected that foreign Catholic powers might try to use Mary as a tool against him, so he treated his own daughter as a potential enemy agent. The king's suspicions extended to his medical care, creating a dangerous situation where doctors were afraid to provide honest diagnoses or treatments. Suggesting that the king might be seriously ill was considered treason, so physicians had to find ways to treat his conditions without acknowledging their severity. This led to increasingly ineffective treatments and the progression of diseases that might have been manageable with proper care. Doctors who failed to improve the king's condition faced imprisonment or execution, while those who showed too much knowledge of his symptoms were suspected of planning to use that information against him. Henry's relationship with his son Edward was complicated by his paranoia and his desperate need for a male heir. While he adored the boy, he also feared that others might try to use Edward against him or might try to hasten his own death to put the child on the throne. This led to Edward being kept under virtual house arrest, surrounded by guards and tutors who reported his every word and action to the king. The boy grew up in an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, never knowing if the people around him were protectors or potential threats. The transformation of the royal court into a police state had far-reaching consequences for English society. Noble families that had served the crown for generations found themselves under suspicion for imaginary crimes. The constant threat of accusations led to a breakdown in the traditional relationships between the monarchy and the aristocracy. Many nobles fled to their country estates to avoid court life entirely, while others sent their children abroad to escape the king's increasingly erratic behavior. Then came the finale that perfectly captured the grotesque nature of his entire reign. By January 1547, Henry's condition had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer leave his bed. His body had swollen to such enormous proportions that his skin was stretched tight and had taken on a waxy, translucent appearance. The leg ulcers had become so infected that they were literally consuming his flesh, and the smell had become so overwhelming that even his most loyal servants could barely stand to be in the same room. The king's death, when it finally came on January 28, 1547, was both a relief and a logistical nightmare. His body had become so bloated with internal gases that moving it required special equipment and procedures that had never been necessary for any previous monarch. The corpse was immediately wrapped in lead sheets to contain the smell and prevent further decomposition, but even these measures proved inadequate. The body was then placed in a specially constructed coffin with multiple layers of lead lining and wooden reinforcement, creating a container that weighed over half a ton. Henry's body had become so bloated with internal gases that his specially reinforced lead-lined coffin couldn't contain the pressure. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, the unthinkable happened. The coffin literally exploded. The sound was reportedly heard over a mile away, and the force of the explosion was strong enough to crack the wooden hearse that carried it. Rotting royal remains splattered across the inside of the vehicle, while the stench forced the funeral procession to halt immediately. The smell was so overpowering that horses began to panic, and several mourners fainted or became violently ill. Servants had to clean up chunks of their former king with buckets and rags, a task that took several hours and required multiple teams of workers. The cleanup crew had to work in shifts because the smell was so overwhelming that nobody could endure it for more than a few minutes at a time. Witnesses reported seeing dogs licking up pieces of Henry VIII from the country road, an image so grotesque that several contemporary chroniclers refused to record it in their official accounts of the funeral. The exploded coffin had to be rebuilt on the spot, and additional lead lining was brought from London to ensure that the remains could be safely transported the rest of the way to Windsor. Even burial became a disaster. The ground at Windsor Castle kept collapsing under the weight of the massive coffin, requiring multiple attempts to keep the king's remains underground. The first grave collapsed completely when the coffin was lowered, forcing workers to excavate a much larger and deeper hole. The second attempt failed when the sides of the grave gave way, nearly crushing several of the burial crew. It took 3 separate excavations and the construction of stone reinforcements before the grave was stable enough to hold the enormous coffin. For years afterward, people reported strange noises and terrible smells emanating from Henry's tomb. The sounds were described as groaning, bubbling, and occasionally what seemed like muffled screaming. The smells were so persistent and so foul that the chapel where Henry was buried had to be abandoned for several months, while efforts were made to seal the tomb more effectively. Some visitors reported feeling nauseous or faint when approaching the burial site, and several claimed to have seen strange lights or shadows near the tomb. The psychological impact of Henry's death on those who had served him was profound. Many servants who had been present during his final weeks suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some became obsessed with cleanliness and refused to eat certain foods that reminded them of the king's condition. Others developed chronic nightmares and had difficulty sleeping. Several of the servants who had been responsible for his personal care died within months of his death, possibly from infections contracted during their service, but also potentially from the psychological strain of their experiences. Sweet. The explosion of Henry's coffin became a symbol for many of his subjects of divine judgment against a tyrant. Preachers across England cited the incident as evidence that God himself had rejected the king, and the story became part of English folklore for generations. The image of the once mighty ruler reduced to scattered remains on a country road served as a powerful reminder of the ultimate fate that awaits all earthly power, no matter how absolute it may seem. This is the real Henry VIII, not the charismatic figure of popular culture, but a walking catastrophe whose body betrayed him as dramatically as he betrayed everyone around him. A man so consumed by paranoia and gluttony that he transformed one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms into his personal chamber of horrors. The most powerful ruler in England became a prisoner of his own rotting flesh, and even death couldn't end his capacity for causing absolute chaos. His reign serves as a terrifying example of what happens when absolute power combines with physical and mental deterioration, creating a perfect storm of human misery that affected an entire nation for decades. The legacy of Henry's final years extended far beyond his own death. The trauma he inflicted on the English court system the legal precedents he set in his paranoia, and the psychological damage he caused to an entire generation of nobles and servants had lasting effects on English society. The explosion of his coffin became a defining moment that symbolized the ultimate fate of tyranny, reminding future generations that even the most absolute power is ultimately subject to the same physical laws and moral judgments that govern all human existence.